All right, good Tuesday morning to you. Beautiful day outside today, so I figured I'd do my video today outside. Hope everybody's doing well, and hopefully you can get outside and enjoy this pretty day today. So where we left off in World War II, the Axis powers were definitely having some success. Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor and had basically taken over all of the Pacific Ocean for the most part. Hitler has conquered Western Europe, with the exception of Britain, and pretty much all of Eastern Europe, and was currently trying to attack and conquer the Soviet Union. So where we left off, it certainly looked like the Axis powers were in a good position to win this war. Then we start battling back in the Pacific is what we've spoken about, and it took some time, but eventually we won a pretty big battle at Midway, and that was the turning point in that war. After Midway, we were definitely before Midway we were definitely losing. After Midway, we're definitely winning, and we're going on the offensive. So we go from being the attacked to the attackers, and our strategy was island hopping, and we'll get back to that probably tomorrow. But that's kind of where we left off. We kind of took a time out from the war yesterday and talked about that horrific event known as the Holocaust, and which was a terrible, terrible event that was happening during World War II. But back to the war. Today, the Allied powers are going to make a few strides, big strides, win a few big battles, and get closer to victory. So for Stalin, he is desperately wanting Britain and America to invade France. He's getting his butt kind of kicked right now. The Germans are just hammering him, and Stalin wants us to go into France, and then that would kind of force Germany back into a two-front war like they were in World War I. Britain and America, we decide to attack North Africa first, and that made Stalin really mad because that really didn't help Stalin out too much. So Stalin wants us to go ahead and invade France, which was controlled by which was Germany at this point, but America and Britain decide to go to North Africa first. So the battle down there is called the main battle. It's called the Battle of El Alamein, and I forgot to review this with you, but Hitler had gone down to Africa to actually have to bail out his friend Mussolini, who was in trouble down there. And Hitler, using his general known as Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, he's going to take over North Africa. So that's why Britain and America are having to go down there. And like I said, the Battle of El Alamein was a huge battle down there. It was led by a British general named Montgomery, Bernard Montgomery, sometimes called Monty, and they kind of take the German tanks by surprise at the Battle of El Alamein, and they win a decisive victory there. Okay, so at that point, and El Alamein was near Egypt. Okay, so at that point, the British start pushing the Germans to the west. This is also about the time when we Americans arrive, and we start coming in from the east. And what we end up doing is surrounding them and catching them in the middle. And at that point, Erwin Rommel and his corps of African tanks was crushed in May of 1943. So that was a huge victory for the Allied powers. Started with the Battle of El Alamein. Then the good guys are going to surround and smush the bad guys and totally drive them out of North Africa. Okay, so now we're hopping back over to the Soviet Union. In a previous video, I said there were two different areas of this war, and you could probably say there's actually three. There's the war in the Pacific theater. Then there's the European theater, like the war in France and Germany. And then there's also a war going on in the Soviet Union. So that's kind of like a third area of the world where the war is going on. So we're going back over to the Soviet Union. So where we left off there, Hitler had basically surrounded Leningrad, and surrounded Moscow. Leningrad was St. Petersburg, but when the communists took it over, they changed all the names. So Leningrad was in deep trouble. Moscow was in deep trouble. But then the winter set in, and fighting just kind of chilled out, literally, for the winter months. So when that winter of 1941 ended, fighting resumes. Now Hitler has his eyes on a new Russian city called Stalingrad, and today it's called Volgograd, Volgo, Volgograd. It's a city of a bunch of factories. So you can see in a war why you would want to take your enemy's city, which had a bunch of factories. Stalin, it's named after him at this point, Stalingrad, and he's like, save my city at all costs. So it's going to be the same story as Leningrad and Moscow. The Germans kind of surround the city, bombard the city, and it's not looking good for Stalingrad. It looks like it's going to have the same fate as Leningrad and Moscow. But this Battle of Stalingrad, and by the way, this is going to be the turning point in the war in the Soviet Union. Midway was the turning point in the Pacific. Stalingrad is the turning point in the Soviet Union. Starts in August of 1942. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, starts just bombing the heck out of the city. Basically destroys about 99% of the city. So pretty much destroys the city. So it's another tough year of fighting, and then another winter sets in. This time, though, the Soviets are going to use the winter to their advantage. When fighting stops and they're just freezing during the winter, the Soviets are going to surround Stalingrad, which is occupied by German soldiers. And they're going to cut off the food supply, cut off trade. So now these German soldiers are freezing and starving. Sounds a lot like what happened to Napoleon's men a long time ago. And even though Hitler gave the order, no retreat, they were done. Starving, freezing. Just like that, they went from like winning in the Soviet Union, and then after this event where the Soviets surrounded them, cut off their food and supplies, it just like a turn in that battle, quick turn the other direction. So what ends up happening in February of 43, 90,000 frostbitten, starved German soldiers are going to surrender. And Germany had 330,000, and only 90,000 were still alive and around to surrender. So this really hurt the German army, and at this point, Germany is definitely going to be losing in the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is definitely going to be winning. So Stalingrad, turning point in the Soviet Union. Okay, so let's hop back over to Europe, or where we were just now, the West, in Africa. And once we won in North Africa, which is like right here, okay, where is the nearest bad guy? Right there, Italy. So from North Africa, we're going to go up to Italy, and that's where Mussolini is. And we're going to invade Italy. On July 10th of 1943, Allied forces, that's the good guys, us and Britain, we land on Sicily. That's that little island that looks like Italy is kicking, and captured it. Took us about a month, but we're going to take over Sicily. Our victory there motivated the Italian citizens who didn't like Mussolini, because not all Italians liked him. I mean, he kind of hijacked the government. It motivated the non-fascist Italians, and they still had their king, Emmanuel III. And I guess knowing that we were there backing them up gave them the courage to overthrow Mussolini. So they're going to overthrow him. Unfortunately for us, there are Germans still in Italy, and they're going to help him come back to power. So fighting is going to last there for, let's see, at least a couple more years. But he wasn't the dictator that he was, before the war. There's definitely Italians there standing up to them. We're there, you know, and our fighting in Italy was tough fighting, but it was successful. We were able to defeat the Italians, defeat the Germans, defeat Mussolini, and help cause his downfall. Eventually, they're going to capture the Italians who didn't like him are going to capture him, and they actually execute him and with a gun, and then they hang his body up in the city of Milan. And I'm not sure how long it stayed there, but the Italians did that to Mussolini. He ends up getting executed by his own people, and his body hung up in the streets for everyone to see. Okay, the last part of today's video, I just want to talk about what the civilians went through during the war. Okay, now civilians in Great Britain and in the Soviet Union, they suffered immensely. In Great Britain, they were getting bombed in the Battle of Britain, and in the Soviet Union, they were getting starved and having to eat rats and things like that. So citizens in those two countries suffered tremendously. Now, there weren't really any major battles in America. So unless you lived in Hawaii, which you had Pearl Harbor, but other than that, civilians in America didn't suffer like civilians in other countries. So we were more fortunate for sure than some of those other countries. All right, but civilians in America did have to make sacrifices. If we wanted to win this war, everybody was going to have to pitch in and do their part. So one way we started doing this is like business owners, factory owners were asked to change the way they do things. Maybe you own a car factory. Okay, well, during the war, we don't really need cars. What we need during the war is tanks and jeeps. So during the war, factories changed what they were making. Okay, a typewriter company, the book talks about. We don't need that many typewriters to beat Hitler. So they changed their factory around where they could start making shells, bullets, big bullets, big shells for our weapons. So during the war, factories and businesses changed what they're doing to help win the war. All right. So if you remember, we were in the middle of this Great Depression, and now this war, which is a terrible thing, it's going to get our factories really moving again. So this war is going to help get us out of this Great Depression. All right. Along with the New Deal, the war also helps get us out of the Great Depression. All right. Now, if our factories are making stuff for the Army, they're not making stuff for us, like civilian type goods. So you're going to see shortages of civilian type goods. So that means we civilians are going to have to cut back on what we use, and that's called rationing. So our government turned to rationing, which is where they only allowed us to use a certain amount of stuff. For example, meat. We couldn't eat as much meat. We couldn't use as much sugar. We couldn't. We had to be careful with the tires and our gasoline. Like everything. We were asked to use less so that our soldiers could use more. Also, we were asked to use less because the factories were not making as much stuff for us. They were making stuff for the military. All right. So that's rationing. That's something American citizens and all citizens of all countries were asked to do to help their country win the war. Now today, if we were in a war and we were asked to sacrifice, would we be loyal enough to do it? I don't know. I hope so, but back then it was a different country, and maybe we were a little bit more patriotic back then, perhaps. In World War I, we talked about propaganda. There was also World War II propaganda, usually in the form of posters. All right, maybe not as famous as the World War I propaganda posters, but definitely there was some propaganda going on as well. Let's see, what else? You also had everybody pitching, even the little guys. Like in Moscow, This one dude went around collecting a bunch of like scrap metal so that he could give it over to his government, and that would help them make bullets and shells. One Russian family used its life savings to buy a tank for the army. And here in America, kids would save their pennies and would buy what's called war bonds. And basically, war bonds like an investment. You buy it from the government. 10, 20, 30 years later, you turn it in, and the government pays you back plus interest. So it's basically a way of loaning money to the government during a war, and they pay you back plus interest. So it's kind of a safe investment. You're not going to get rich off of it, but it's a safe investment, and it helps the government pay for the war at the same time. So, all right, last thing of the day. So this is a pretty controversial topic here, and I can see both sides. Okay, so I'm not saying it was right, it was wrong. I don't know the right answer, and luckily I'm not the one who has to make these decisions. But we did have to limit some civil rights during this war. Well, I don't guess we had to, but we did. So the book talks about these Japanese internment camps at this point, and so we're at war with Japan, and there were a lot of Japanese Americans here in our country, and we had to determine what to do with them. Are they on our side? Are they loyal to us? And what do we do? So what we ended up doing is we ended up placing them in what was called internment camps. So the American government took them from their homes and placed them in these camps or prisons. And now they're not like concentration camps. They weren't being worked to death or anything like that. But they were basically being arrested and imprisoned in these camps and had not done anything wrong. And that violates quite a few of the bills, the Bill of Rights, the rights in the Bill of Rights. It goes against John Locke and his life, liberty, and property, and the government's there to protect those things. So this went against many of our core American beliefs. All right. But at the same time, and I'm not saying this, we should have done this, but I can see the argument for it. You can't just let potential enemies and potential spies be freely roaming through your country either. So, but yeah, that's what those Japanese internment camps were like. Unfortunately, these Japanese not only had their freedom taken away, but they lost a lot of property and lost a lot of money as well. You know, a lot of them knew they were going away, so they tried to sell a bunch of their property really quickly without maybe thinking it through or getting the best deal on their property. So, yeah, a lot of them lost a lot of money. I mean, it's terribly unfair how they were treated, and their civil rights were infringed upon, definitely. But our military leaders thought that was the safest way to handle that population in our country. So I can definitely see how it was wrong for sure, but I can definitely see the argument behind it as well. So more of a present day example, what if we went to war with Mexico, which would never happen. We're never, we have a pretty good relationship with Mexico, but what if we went to war with Mexico? We have all these Mexican Americans in our country. I mean, that would be a tough war. Would they be more on our side, or would they be more on their side? And we would have to decide how to handle that group in our country. Luckily, hopefully, that'll never happen, because I don't ever see us going to war against Mexico. But it's the same kind of concept there. So, okay, I think I've spoken to you enough for today. The next 2 days now, y'all are going to be writing a performance final. It counts 5% of your grade. I've already given you a couple of days head start, basically, if you've taken advantage of it. I am going to post a video tomorrow, even though you're going to be writing an essay. I am going to post a video tomorrow talking about a few more battles, because we're kind of running out of time, and I got to get at least through World War II, because we do have one more test to take over World War II. So I got to get through this before we can start focusing on the final. So, which is right around the corner, unfortunately. So, hope you have a wonderful day, and we will see you tomorrow.